Marcus Reynolds sat in his high-rise office, gazing out at the city skyline, his mind heavy with unease. His airline, Skyway International, had been his life's work, a company built on the foundation of quality service and inclusivity. Yet, whispers of discrimination and poor treatment of passengers had begun surfacing. He had received reports of customer complaints, anonymous messages from employees, and even a few viral videos circulating online, hinting at a culture he never intended to foster. His executive team assured him these were isolated incidents, the work of disgruntled customers exaggerating their experiences. But Marcus trusted his instincts. A gut feeling told him there was more to the story, and he wasn't the type of man to sit behind a desk waiting for answers. If his airline was failing its customers, he needed to see it firsthand. The plan came together quickly. He would travel as an ordinary passenger on one of his own flights under an assumed name, shedding the trappings of his wealth and influence. No tailored suits, no assistants, no first-class privileges. Just a man with a ticket and a destination. He chose an economy seat on a long-haul flight, a route notorious for recent complaints, and booked under the name Mark Robbins, a retired teacher from Atlanta. The morning of the flight, he dressed the part. A well-worn hoodie, loose jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He left his designer luggage behind, opting for a scuffed duffel bag that carried only the essentials. He examined himself in the mirror before leaving his penthouse, ensuring he looked nothing like the billionaire mogul whose face occasionally graced business magazines. He barely recognized himself, but that was the point. At the airport, the test began immediately. As he approached the check-in counter, the airline agent barely looked up. A young couple ahead of him, dressed in designer clothing, received smiles and easy conversation. But when it was his turn, the agent's tone flattened. "Name, Mark Robbins," he said, handing over his ticket. The agent typed without acknowledgement, then slid his boarding pass across the counter, without a word. Marcus studied her face, searching for the warmth his company prided itself on. There was none. He was just another body in the system. Security was uneventful, and soon he stood at the departure gate, observing. Passengers boarded in groups, but there was a pattern. The well-dressed and well-spoken received extra courtesies, small smiles, additional assistance, even unsolicited upgrades. Meanwhile, those who looked more like him in this disguise, casual, unassuming, were met with indifference or subtle impatience. He boarded with the rest of economy class, weaving through first class, as he made his way to the back of the plane. Plush leather seats, champagne already poured, hushed conversations. It was the experience he had designed for premium passengers, and it looked impeccable. But that was never in question. Reaching his row, he settled into a narrow seat, feeling the stiffness of the cushion beneath him. The plane filled up around him, passengers stuffing bags into overhead compartments, murmuring about the cramped space. Across the aisle, a young mother struggled with her toddler, exhaustion evident in her eyes. A few rows ahead, an elderly black couple sat quietly, the husband adjusting his wife's seatbelt with patient care. Then came the flight attendants. The first walked through first class, her tone bright and attentive, ensuring every seat was met with personalized service. But as she entered economy, her demeanor changed. The warmth dimmed. Efficiency replaced hospitality. Marcus watched as a flight attendant, Lisa, her name tag gleamed under the cabin lights, passed by his row without a glance. A passenger a few seats ahead stopped her to request a blanket. She barely paused. "Only for first class," she said curtly before moving on. Minutes later, another passenger in business class asked the same thing. This time, Lisa's response was different. "Of course, sir," she said with a smile, fetching a blanket without hesitation. Marcus felt a slow burn in his chest. Service was always tiered. He understood that. People paid for luxury, and with that came certain privileges. But courtesy? Basic respect? That wasn't something that should come with a price tag. As the plane taxied down the runway, Marcus leaned back in his seat, letting the reality sink in. He had spent years believing his airline was built on fairness and excellence. Now, only moments into this flight, he could already see the cracks forming beneath the polished exterior. This wasn't just about inefficiency. It was about perception, about who was deemed worthy of kindness, and who was dismissed without a thought. The wheels lifted off the ground, and the journey began. The hum of the aircraft settled into a steady rhythm, a quiet undercurrent to the occasional murmur of passengers and the rustling of in-flight magazines. Marcus adjusted his posture, stretching his legs as much as the cramped space allowed. A few seats ahead, a man in a tailored suit shifted comfortably. His seat reclined far enough to encroach on the passenger behind him. No one protested. The invisible hierarchy of air travel was already at play. Not long after takeoff, the flight attendants moved through the aisles, distributing beverages. Marcus watched as Lisa, the same attendant who had been indifferent earlier, maneuvered through the cabin with an expression that suggested she was merely enduring the shift. She stopped the row ahead of him, greeting a well-dressed passenger with a polished, professional smile. "What can I get for you, sir?" "Sparkling water," the man said, without looking up from his phone. She returned within seconds, bottle in hand, and moved on. When she reached Marcus's row, her demeanor shifted again, the warmth draining from her expression. "Water, please," he requested, keeping his tone neutral. "We only serve business class first," she said, barely pausing before stepping past him. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, but he let it go. Maybe it was an oversight. Maybe she was following a specific order of service. He waited, watching as she made her way further down the aisle, continuing to hand out drinks. 5 minutes passed. 10. She never returned. A few seats across from him, the elderly black couple from before sat patiently, their hands folded over their laps. The husband, a distinguished-looking man with silvered hair and a quiet dignity about him, pressed the call button. Lisa approached with visible impatience. "Yes. My wife isn't feeling well," the man said gently. "Would it be possible to get some water?" Lisa sighed, glancing toward the front of the cabin as if searching for an excuse. "We're in the middle of service," she said. "You'll have to wait." The man's jaw tensed. He opened his mouth, perhaps to insist, but then closed it again, his expression shifting into something resigned. Marcus felt his fingers curl into a slow fist. He had built this airline from the ground up, believing it would stand as a testament to excellence. But here, within the narrow confines of economy class, was the stark reality of a system that operated on unspoken bias. Another flight attendant, a younger woman named Rachel, if he remembered the name correctly, noticed the interaction and stepped in. Without hesitation, she fetched a cup of water and handed it to the elderly man with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry for the delay, sir," she said softly. Lisa shot her a glare, but Rachel ignored it, turning back to continue her work. The meal service began next, and the pattern continued. Marcus watched as the premium cabin received carefully plated entrees, fragrant and steaming beneath silver covers. In economy, the choices were far less appealing. Stale sandwiches wrapped in plastic, accompanied by a half-hearted selection of crackers. When the cart reached his row, Marcus accepted his meal, though his appetite had long since vanished. Across the aisle, a young black woman hesitated before speaking up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but firm. "Would it be possible to get an extra snack? I didn't have a chance to eat before the flight." Lisa barely looked at her. "We only have enough for one per passenger." Minutes later, a man in a button-down shirt made the same request. This time, Lisa smiled and handed over a second portion without question. Marcus exhaled slowly. It wasn't blatant, not the kind of discrimination that made headlines, but it was there, in the tone, the body language, the careful rationing of courtesy. A pattern so insidious that it could be dismissed as coincidence by those who didn't know what to look for. The final straw came when turbulence rocked the cabin. It wasn't severe, just enough to jostle drinks and send a ripple of unease through the passengers. A young black man a few rows ahead of Marcus gripped his armrests, his breath coming quicker. Lisa passed by, saw his distress, and stopped, but not to reassure him. "Sir, you need to calm down," she said. Her voice clipped. The man blinked up at her, visibly trying to steady himself. I said calm down. Marcus sat up straighter. The words weren't comforting. They were a warning. A few rows ahead, a white woman gripped her husband's arm, looking equally shaken. A different flight attendant crouched beside her, murmuring reassurances, offering her a small bottle of wine to help her relax. 2 passengers. The same fear. 2 entirely different responses. Something inside Marcus snapped into place. He had seen enough. He pressed his call button. Lisa turned, her expression already weary, as she approached his seat. "What do you need?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the distinct impatience of someone who had decided certain passengers weren't worth extra effort. Marcus met her gaze, his voice even. "I'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant." Her lips twitched, the corners pulling into something that resembled amusement. "Oh, and why is that?" He tilted his head slightly, studying her. She had no idea who he was. And soon, that was going to change. Lisa arched a brow, her stance shifting into something smug, as if amused by the mere idea of an economy passenger requesting the lead flight attendant. Marcus held her gaze, unflinching, waiting. A few beats of silence passed before she exhaled sharply, muttering something under her breath. "I'll see if they're available," she said, turning on her heel and disappearing toward the front of the cabin. The energy in the surrounding seats shifted. The passengers, who had been quiet observers, now watched with interest. The elderly black man, still holding his wife's hand, gave Marcus a slow, knowing nod. Across the aisle, the young woman who had been denied a second snack folded her arms, eyes flicking between Marcus and where Lisa had gone. Minutes passed. No one came. Marcus pressed the call button again. This time, Lisa returned with a forced smile, her posture tight. "Sir, our lead flight attendant is very busy. If this is about the water or the meal service, I assure you, we're following policy." Marcus didn't blink. "Then I'll wait." A muscle in her jaw twitched, her patience thinning. It was clear she expected him to back down, to accept the silent, unwritten rules of this game. But he wasn't just a passenger. He was the man who had built this airline, and he was done watching from the shadows. A ripple of whispers passed through the cabin as another flight attendant, an older man with a crisp uniform and a name tag that read David, finally arrived. His expression was carefully neutral, though there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes as he looked between Marcus and Lisa. "I understand you requested to speak with me," David said, his tone professional but distant. Marcus nodded. "I did." He straightened slightly, his voice carrying the quiet authority he had honed in years of boardroom negotiations. "I've been observing this flight from the moment I boarded. I've watched the service, the interactions, and the disparities in how passengers are treated. And I have a serious concern about how this airline is operating." David's brows lifted slightly, but he remained composed. "Sir, if you've had an issue with service, I assure you we can address it after the flight. Right now, our crew is busy ensuring a smooth experience for all passengers." "A smooth experience," Marcus echoed, tilting his head slightly. "That's an interesting choice of words." He gestured subtly toward the young black man who had been told to calm down during turbulence, the elderly couple ignored when they needed water, the young woman who had been dismissed without a second thought. "Because from what I've seen, that experience is only smooth for certain people." David stiffened, his practiced mask slipping for just a second. Lisa, standing slightly behind him, folded her arms, scoffing under her breath. "Sir, I don't think this is." Marcus exhaled slowly, then reached up, removing his cap. The small motion shouldn't have meant anything, but suddenly, the shift in energy was palpable. Then he removed his glasses. Recognition hit Lisa first. Her smirk faltered. Her arms loosened, falling to her sides as her breath hitched. David, slower to react, blinked twice, studying his face, really studying it now, before his expression morphed from passive professionalism to dawning horror. A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the cabin. A man 2 rows back muttered, "Wait, is that?" Marcus let the moment settle, let the weight of his identity sink in. Then he leaned forward just slightly, lowering his voice so only those closest could hear. I built this airline. His words were measured, deliberate. From nothing. I put my name, my reputation, my money into it, because I believed it could be something different, something better. He let his gaze flick toward Lisa, whose face was rapidly losing color. And this? What I've seen today. This is not what I built. Lisa stumbled over her words. I didn't. You didn't know who I was. His voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. And that's the problem. Because if I had been wearing a suit, if I had walked on with the look of money, we wouldn't be having this conversation. David swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Mr. Reynolds. I'm not here as Mr. Reynolds. Marcus's voice never rose, but it didn't need to. The authority, the sheer presence he carried, did all the work. I came here as a passenger, a customer who paid for a ticket, just like everyone else in this cabin. And I've been treated like an inconvenience at best, an afterthought at worst. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Lisa looked like she wanted to disappear. David shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped in front of him. Marcus exhaled slowly, then leaned back, settling into his seat. So tell me, he said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. Is this how Skyway International operates when no one's watching? David opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Mr. Rain, sir, I sincerely apologize for any lapses in service. I can assure you, we take passenger experience very seriously. Marcus studied him, unimpressed. Do you? Lisa flinched. Across the aisle, the elderly man who had been ignored earlier sat up straighter. The young woman who had been denied an extra snack folded her arms, satisfaction flickering across her face. Even passengers who had been silent this entire time now watched with quiet approval. David cleared his throat, clearly searching for the right words. I'll be reporting this to upper management, of course. And we'll be addressing any necessary corrective actions. You won't need to report it, Marcus interrupted, his voice smooth. Because I'll be handling it personally. Lisa paled further. David nodded quickly, his forehead damp with sudden nerves. Understood, sir. The tension in the cabin hung thick in the air, but Marcus wasn't interested in drawing this out. The message had been delivered. Loudly, he picked up the plastic cup of water that had finally, miraculously, appeared in front of him. He swirled the liquid inside, thoughtful. Then he took a sip, set it down, and said, Now, let's see how the rest of this flight goes. The tension in the cabin remained thick, lingering like an unspoken challenge in the air. The passengers, who had silently endured mistreatment, now carried an unshakable awareness. Change was coming. Marcus could feel it in the way they straightened their posture, how their eyes met his with a newfound confidence. They knew who he was now. More importantly, they knew what he had seen. Lisa had retreated toward the front of the plane, her usual sharp demeanor replaced by stiff, jerky movements. David lingered nearby, clearly unsure whether to stay or disappear altogether. The crew had been shaken. But this wasn't about their discomfort. It was about the passengers, about the people who had been treated as lesser simply because no one with power had been watching. Until now. Marcus leaned back in his seat, the hum of the engines filling the space around him. The remainder of the flight carried a different energy. Service became more attentive. Rachel, the younger flight attendant who had stepped in earlier, moved through the cabin with genuine care, offering water, checking on passengers, ensuring blankets and pillows found their way to those who needed them. She was proving in quiet, deliberate actions that kindness had always been possible. The elderly man across the aisle nodded his thanks as she refilled his wife's water cup without hesitation. Marcus caught the brief flicker of relief in the man's eyes. He had probably experienced a lifetime of being ignored, of being told, in 1,000 small ways, that his comfort mattered less. Lisa returned only once, her voice stiff, her hands trembling slightly as she asked, "Is there anything else I can do for you, sir?" Marcus studied her, not with cruelty, but with measured intent. "No, Lisa," he said calmly. "Not for me." He let his gaze shift subtly toward the passengers around him. But if you're asking that question now, I expect you to start asking it of everyone. She swallowed hard, nodded quickly, then turned and disappeared without another word. By the time the plane began its descent, the shift was undeniable. Service had improved, but more importantly, an unspoken understanding had settled over the cabin, an acknowledgement that something had been exposed. The quiet injustices, the subtle biases, the silent dismissals that had gone unnoticed for too long were now laid bare. As the wheels touched down and the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Marcus pulled out his phone and drafted a message to his executive team. Emergency meeting. My office. 9 a.m. No excuses. Asterisk asterisk. The seatbelt sign dimmed, and passengers rose to collect their bags. As Marcus stood, he turned toward the elderly man he had been watching throughout the flight. Sir, Marcus said, extending a hand. I appreciate your patience today. The older man studied him for a moment before clasping his hand in a firm grip. And I appreciate you seeing what we've seen for years. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet truth. Marcus nodded once, a silent promise passing between them. As he made his way toward the exit, Rachel caught up with him. Mr. Reynolds, she said hesitantly, I just wanted to say, not all of us are like that. Some of us really do care. I know, Marcus said, offering her a small but genuine smile. And you proved that today. She exhaled, relief flickering across her face. Thank you, sir. Marcus stepped off the plane, breathing in the crisp airport air. This was just the beginning. Tomorrow, there would be firings. There would be retraining, restructuring, and hard conversations. Some people would resist, some would learn, and some would leave. But Skyway International would never operate the same way again. Not while he was watching.